All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody participating in this panel from wherever part of the continent or the world you are in. I am Professor Christian Onyeji of the University of Nigeria, moderating this panel on decolonizing African compositions, deconstructing the theory and practice using traditional models. We are part of the panels set up by ICTM to discuss decolonization. So this panel is made up of 5 speakers. There are one, Ukeme Udoh of University of Uyo, Nigeria, Johnson J. Akpakpan of University of Uyo, Nigeria, Charles Mandor Asenye of University of Uyo, Nigeria, Boniface Akpakpan Inyang, College of Education, Akwa, Ibom State, Nigeria, and Maria Agatha Ozar of the University of Port Harcourt, Nigeria. The summary of their panel presentation goes thus. Africa's most extreme form of colonization has been the underlying or hidden institutional colonization that constitutes internal systems affecting music making and its compositional practices founded on Christianity and colonial educational models. These models have been developed using the hegemonic binaries, high culture or low culture, primitive music or modern music, global north or global south, and so on, that questioned the legitimacy of creativity in music. Thus, for example, unless musical creativity is modeled in the written tradition of the West, that is hymns, anthems, and works that represent the various historical epochs, Baroque, classical, romantic, etc., they are not accepted in Nigeria. In Nigeria, Western art music has created a dichotomy between elitist composers, that's the gown, and local music practitioners, the town, to propagate internal colonizing agencies. Today, the continuing influence of Eurocentric cultural models in the theory and practice of music composition has resulted in the search for appropriate styles and idioms that are Africa-based, Africa-sensitive in composition practices in Nigeria and Africa in general. Thus, modern Nigerian composers have presented compositions based on indigenous paradigms, aiming to reveal and define compositional attempts and styles that draw from Africa's unique creative idioms and indigenous musical elements. This panel presents various models of colonization in music composition, from historical background to practical examples of how Africans have attempted to decolonize deeply rooted and epistemic systems using traditional or indigenous models. Their presentations have already been recorded and sent to Carlos Yoda. I'll request him to play seamlessly those presentations already recorded so that at the end of the presentations, we will engage in discussions, questions and answers as appropriate. Thank you and welcome to the panel again. Carlos, over to you.
Hi everyone. Music composition, by definition, is an aspect of cultural expression that reveals deliberate effort by composers to capture social, cultural, and sometimes abstract phenomena in sonic forms within various cultural locations. By this definition, the entire concept of music is defined within the processes and product of what is called composition in Western Eurocentric sense, or music making in African indigenous societies. In addition, it involves creative acts or the creation of what is cultural acceptance music in the West, or simply songs in Africa. Different approaches to this creative endeavor have always followed different paths in combining creative idioms and tools while showcasing diverse creative limits and the endowment of different composers in oral and written forms. The difference between written and oral composition became obvious to Africans through Nigerians when some immigrants who identified themselves as Christian missionaries invaded the regions, especially when written composition was overly emphasized as being a superior quality music. The importation of Western music by the Christian missionaries and its imposition on Africa brought a new mode of cultural expression involving notation, tonality and modal scales, harmony and harmonic rules such as root motion theories, scale degree theories, and function theories, counterpoint, melodic organization, textual modulation, etc. For example, harmonic laws are those that describe the ways in which a tonic exerts its control and must be expressed in terms of scale degrees. Contrapuntal laws are those that operate independently of a controlling tonic and can be expressed without recourse to a scale degree concept. In addition, there are laws of caudal dissonant treatments and many others. There is a high degree of tension within these theoretical systems at the interface between contrapuntal laws and harmonic laws, for example, among Western theories and composers. Despite these tensions, Western theoretical models have continued to dominate discussions and practices of composition in Africa as a model of global music, that is, music as a universal language that favors the Western hegemonic system. However, this new image of music has resulted in a crisis of identity, leading to questions of appropriate compositional styles and idioms of expression, which continues to beg for answers by both music educators and composers alike in Africa since the encounter with the West. It is important to note that before the colonial invasion, indigenous conceptions of creative acts operated within rituals and routines that defined and regulated life within the community. By this, African composers' creative outputs became meaningful within the context of a specific community. Generally, oral compositions as an indigenous model of creativity had and still have a close interface with language, cultural values, and beliefs encapsulated in songs, movement, that is dance, and other nuances within the acceptable cultural ethos. Let us take a look at an example of music making among the BPO culture of Nigeria. This group is known as Udoh Cultural Group. It displays 4 horns named after a mother, a Kauta, and her 3 sons, Akpan, Udoh, and Udoh. In the sample, there are different dimensions of cultural expressions portrayed in the music, from language and depths of interpretations to meaning in the song text, to symbolisms in the instrument, and so on, that are models of cultural identity. Although there are melodic, rhythmic, and harmonic representations in the music, the BPO traditions do not verbalize these elements. However, a different model of music was introduced to Africans through Christianity. For example, hymns, which represented a model of Western music, was introduced as music of Christianity. It represented a new cultural model of music composition and was based on the written traditions of the West. Moreover, these compositions were individual expressions and had an opposing model with African songs. The notion of written music thus questioned the legitimacy or authenticity of oral or written musical cultures all around the world. In addition, oral or written compositions were erroneously called primitive music in a bid to propagate the superiority of Western art music, commonly called high culture, over other musical cultures as low culture. Next is an example of church music. The audio you're about to listen to is a recording of one of my church choirs, where I've served as one of the organists and music director. Of hymns accompanied with piano or organ, and sometimes the orchestra, as we have heard in the audio, as the model of Western European art music, represents a series of reversals for indigenous African expression, a system that amounts to colonization or neocolonization, or what Kofi Agawo calls a musical violence of a very high order, a violence whose psychic and psychological impact remains to be properly explored. Presently, the search for African-based contents and methods for music composition with cultural identity models has been one of the primary concerns of music composers in contemporary Africa, especially in Nigeria. In African-based methods, decolonization can take place, at least a deconstruction of music composition in Nigeria, which is a microcosm of Africa, using indigenous models. However, in promoting a colonial superiority, Western art music constitutes itself into a one-size-fits-all stance, a capitalist system, and now as globalization, where the dichotomy is created between who speaks and who must listen, privileging the imported over the indigenous, colonial languages over local languages, writing over orality, which have continued to set up hegemonic systems as models of new colonization from past colonization, distinguishing the binaries of high and low cultures, global north and global south, and so on. In the subsequent section, I want to present three major examples of colonization in the Nigerian music composition practices and how traditional models can be useful. The Christian missionaries represent an important model of colonialism where music was expressed in Western idioms, English, and written practices, that is, hymns, anthems, and other musical works. The music of the Christians were promoted in schools and the churches through music concerts, festivals, and other activities as models or the standard practice of what was acceptable and in vogue. Outside the church, the indigenous cultures had a different model of music. Although the concept was the same, the idioms were different. For instance, among the people of Nigeria, as I've earlier explained, the concept of music manifested in mbre, which is play, mbre, kolesis, ikwo, unek, mbinge, and other dramatic nuances. The mbre, for instance, as a form of cultural expression, that is, traditional music, was banned by the missionaries in laying the foundation for church music, especially in the Orthodox churches, since it was said to carry pagan connotations. Let us look at one example of the colonizing influence of church music in the model of hymn writing. The metric system of writing hymns in the fixed pattern where the same music dominates different textual representations is counterproductive in tonal languages. In Nigeria, whether Ibibio, Igbo, Yoruba, etc., the indigenous language seldom or never complied with the rhythmical meter of the Western hymns. This is so because the tonal patterns of the indigenous languages never fit the strophic models. Thus, the entire attempt at translating hymns to indigenous languages was a forced marriage to force Africans to distort the languages with cruelty beyond imagination. How then do we decolonize this system? There are two major responses that have emerged in the Nigerian church music. The first accept cultural elements and ideologies of Western origin, but change them in meaning and content to suit their environment in compositional practices. The second is an acculturation process, or a kind of a new African church music style in which the common characteristics of African indigenous music are ingeniously blended with Western musical elements. Although a separatist model also exists that accepts composition only by Africans and containing only pure African musical idioms, let me note here that this separatist attitude may necessarily lead these composers into isolation and stagnation. This is so because modernity has changed our ways of music composition in the African sense. So fusion, synthesis, and other stylistic blends should be accepted on their merit as creative works within specific locations and landscapes. The second example of models of colonization is noticed in the Nigerian music education system. African scholars and composers have argued that the most extreme form of colonization in Africa has been in the underlying or hidden institutional colonization that constitutes internal systems affecting music making and a compositional practice founded on Christianity, as I've already explained, and colonial educational models. By 1960, the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, developed a new music program for training its products on musicality. This program was intended to address the imbalance in the music educational system. For composition, bimusicality was to bring together elements of Western and African music. However, the main problem of bimusical compositions was what model in theory and practice was it supposed to adopt, especially when most trained music composers had their training in Western art music. Ostensibly, the fusion of Western and art music elements demonstrated an unequal power relationship dominated by the structural element in Western art music, melody, rhythm, harmony, and form, and making use of mediums such as voice, piano, an orchestra consisting of Western musical instruments. The next example is an expression of bimusicality. It is a composition of Samuel Akpabut. It is 3 Nigerian dances for string orchestra and percussion, composed in 1962 and published by Oxford University Press in 1977. Please, let's listen. In this sample, I recognize the thematic material which Samuel Akpabut borrowed from the video folk song. Saubok wari yankedam gedio, oh, Saubok wari yankedam gedio. However, the treatment given to the thematic material is Western and colonizing, built around melodic and rhythmic motifs and development, and unburdened of attachment to the external function. Thus, Akpabut concentrates on the music itself, its inner working, and the life of its tone. In this context, the dynamic interactions of indigenous music as community music has been reduced to an absolute music detached from all nuances of context and meaning, except for the metaphorical equivalence of a segment of rhythmic motif, Edam Kedi, assigned to the timpani and other instruments, which is symbolic of the use of drums as signal mode in indigenous society. Or, in the other way, this reading is generally dominated by individual semantic interpretation of written instrumental music dominant in the West. Comparatively, Akpabut's composition here and the first sample of the music I played earlier shares cultural affinity in terms of source of material, but within the context of biomusicality, Western elements have overshadowed the African element. Thus, decolonization will imply creating a reasonable balance between the two cultures, at least promoting the dominance of local over the foreign element. The next musical example is a recording of Ibom choral music that attempts to promote local elements above foreign. Music example here demonstrates Ibibio idioms using synthesized medium, which in this case is Western and colonizing. Although these new experiences are commendable, it is important to note that there are new internal systems, both educational and creative, that have continued to form colonizing agencies of foreign music composition models. For example, elitist composers still treat traditional musical models with disdain, and their composers as individuals not worthy of the nomenclature composers and should rather be identified as village choir masters. The irony being that some of the works of these village choir masters, so-called, are widely accepted within localized domains than works of some of these elitist composers. There are many other creative and stylistic models that blend Western and African elements, which have emerged within biomusicality by indigenous composers. For example, African pianism and domestic piano, which is demonstrated in Christian Onyeji's Ofie for piano. What is being presented here is a third movement. Please, let's watch. This model of expression in African music is valid as it epitomizes the African-Western synergy But the problem is the dominance of piano over African percussive instruments, for example, xylophone, drums, etc., which ought to be juxtaposed as duets in these compositions. But like Ruth Katz has noted, it is abundantly clear that Western art music has lost much of the standing it once enjoyed, though the number of its adherents was always relatively small. In Nigeria today, except in schools and old mission churches, art music has a relatively small audience compared to popular music. Popular music is a synthesis blending aspects of local and global influences to create distinct genres that reflect the environment they arose from and was promoted using radio. This model of popular music resonates with traditional music in bringing together songs, dance, instrumentation, and addresses societal changes, building bridges of the past, present, and future. Unfortunately, popular music has been subjugated in the Nigerian music education curriculum that promotes art music. In addition, there is a dire need for the town-gown synergy to balance the excesses of modernity, digitalization that constitutes modern forms of colonization. Composition in the academy should align with popular music practices to develop a system to control the excesses of commercialization in pop culture, such as nudity, vulgarity, personality cult, drugs, social deviancy, etc., that do not synchronize with African creative models. Our last music video in this segment of the presentation is an example of popular music that blends Ibibio indigenous music, which is demonstrated below. The use of other cultural elements like Yoruba talking drum in the music is a product of intercultural expression in modern Nigerian composition. Please let's watch. It is necessary to note that the melismatic treatment of the song text is Western and colonizing. Although much of the meanings are retained, this form of expression is more Western and foreign than local. Let me note here that the examples illustrated in this section are mere surface or superficial impact compared to the institutionalization of colonialism in Nigeria. As a panel, we look forward to ICTM as a modern voice for decolonizing African composition in the following areas: repatriation of composition of Nigerians domiciled abroad, documentation in a book form, a monograph of modern African compositions, and finally, the publication of a special edition journal in Yearbook of Traditional Music on decolonization that brings together this series of dialogues and discussions. Thank you for listening.
This section of the dialogue focuses on the conventions and principles in the Nigerian compositional practice. By conventions, principles of philosophy, we mean the set of beliefs, the guiding principles, values, and ideas that inspire or motivate the art of music composition and performance as rationalized by the people, which are essential to the understanding and appreciation of the musical arts and society in general. Unfortunately, Western music theory has dominated the entire gamut of music making, that is composition activities, especially within the Nigerian Academy. Fugue, Schoenberg's 12-tone technique, serialism, sonata, and symphony, or other three-movement structures, etc. Western hegemonic system has created a dichotomy of superiority over African creative principles in theory and practice, which points to other troubling questions lurking in the shadows of our colonized minds and societies. However, we also note that another striking problem with this form of neo-colonization has been abandoning inherent creative resources from traditional models by African composers. For example, who has the authority to speak, think, and act? Which voices are actively silenced in compositional practices? To negotiate this equation of power between the colonizer and the colonized, there are depths of institutionalization of Eurocentric hegemony in compositional practices with inherent theoretical underpinnings that needs to be unbundled. So our first port of call is on creative ethnomusicology. By creative ethnomusicology or creative musicology, we mean a concept that was developed by Akin Yuba to conceptualize the relationship between academic research and musical composition. Yuba defines creative musicology as the application of musicology to composition. According to him, the product of research is the publication of its results in the form of speech discourse, whereas in creative musicology, the product is a composition or even an entire creative idiom based on information derived from the research. Creative musicology describes the process that moves from analysis to synthesis and the transformational zone between research and composition. This theory supports traditional models because compositions that emerge out of this concept, if well captured, become a model for treating indigenous musical elements and idioms as new art music. I'm taking some of those quotations from Yuba 2014. The next theory model is that of research composition. It is an approach to composition in which in-depth ethnomusicological research on the indigenous music of a given culture informs the creative and compositional theory of a modern arts music composition. The approach seeks a continuum of traditional musical arts of Africa in modern art music form, Onyeji 2002. It is a compositional process that enables a composer to produce African arts music of any length or magnitude by studying and applying creative elements and idioms from identified African musical types or traditions. The procedure entails ethnomusicological study of identified music type, that is either ethnographic or musicological, that enables the identification of distinctive features of the music type as well as the application of the creative features and idioms in the composition of art music of choice. The essence here is to ensure that the art-composed music captures the spirit of the indigenous music, while at the same time is a transformation of the music in literary form. Research composition identifies the distinctions that exist between ethnomusicology and composition as scholarly and creative fields in music, but at the same time constructs a bridge from one to the other. The next model to consider is native air. Native airs emerged as a model of indigenous music that created danceable songs to counter Western church music, which are hymns and other choral works. This choral style explores and combines the native choral and vocal idioms of an indigenous music tradition of Nigeria and Western stylistic features in its delivery of stories, songs supported and patronized by the Christian churches. Secular versions are effectively rendered on non-religious occasions, while cello versions are also incorporated. An important feature of native airs as indigenous composition model was its model of traditional folk songs and folk tales, especially the secular type, while the biblical and religious texts are used for religious observances. The stylistic features of native airs include a preference for native languages, fairly long story deemed capable for a listening audience, strong bass lines, fairly contrapuntal and polyphonic lines, interspersed with homophonic passages, sometimes on topical issues, strong reliance on tonal inflections, Western choral materials, combined with all possible attempts to retain indigenous norms such as falling tones, commonly called glissando, layered progression of parts, that's parallelism, untranslatable syllables, vowelization, code switching, and others. However, the efforts in this practice have been to remain within the acceptable models of both Western and African choral traditions, except for elitist composers who sees the untrained composers as village choir masters. Next, we look at the theory of African pianism. African pianism may be described as a style of keyboard composition and performance that is influenced by African traditional practices, as found, for example, in the music of drums, xylophones, and thumb pianos. Udoh Igwe's exceptional success in articulating this theory stems from his research into the Ukeme drum tradition of the Ibom of Nigeria, as well as his internalization of idioms of traditional music that he heard while growing up in Nigeria. Udoh's connection of research to composition again exemplifies one of Akin Huber's theories, that of creative musicology already explained above. This theory has been described as using information obtained from field research and analysis of oral tradition musics as the basis of composition. In normal musicology, such information is presented in scholarly publications. African pianism or Africanisms employed in Neo-African keyboard music elements derived from traditional music employs the following technique: thematic repetition, direct borrowings of thematic materials, either rhythmical or tonal, from African traditional sources, the use of rhythmical and or tonal motifs, which, although not borrowed from specific traditional sources, are based on traditional idioms, percussive treatment of the piano, and of course making the piano behave like African instruments. Closely related to African pianism is this other concept of drumistic piano style. This concept explores the percussive nature of piano in mimicking the traditional drums. The drumistic piano style is an approach to piano composition and performance that transfers the techniques of African drumming to the piano. Drumistic piano compositions basically transfer the melorhythmic principles and idioms of African drum music to the piano. As such, it represents a conscious effort to capture the sonic and idiomatic features of traditional drum music for the piano. The approach entails perceiving, responding, and relating to the instruments as one would to traditional drums. Ultimately, it entails drumming on the piano. Although the drumistic piano composition implies drumistic piano performance, I have chosen to discuss this aspect separately in order to highlight the technique for its expression, which is very important. While piano performance technique calls for special application of the 10 fingers on the instruments generally, it does appear that drumistic piano performance requires a special way of relating to the piano that requires a special way of articulating sounds, feeling, and response to the music. It calls for a different manner of performer-music instrument interaction. Although drumistic piano music is essentially contemplative, the performer imaginatively evokes the appropriate performance of traditional music. The performer adjusts his or her psyche and feels as though he or she is playing drums in an ensemble. The left and right hands are imaginatively adjusted to imitate the application of the hands on the drums. The performer attempts to release the hands from the dominance of either one as a technique referred to as emancipation of the hands. Any piano player is aware that the dominance of the right hand over the left hand is imminent. It is essential for drumistic piano players to free both hands so as to enable them interact and dialogue as separate performers in the manner that traditional drummers perform. The operational dynamics entail emancipation of the two hands as well as an empowerment of the left hand, giving it equal strength. The performer needs to bring to bear on the piano performance a clear perception of the drumming technique required for the traditional music, while taking advantage of the unique features of the modern piano. The relationship imposes dual responsibilities on the performer, that is, knowing the piano as a modern instrument and playing it as a traditional drum. Creative interpretation of drumistic music on the piano requires a clear knowledge of drum language, performance nuances, as well as the idiomatic expression of the chosen drum tradition or ensemble. In addition, the technicalities of performance, that is, the touch and release of notes, and performance dynamics require astute perception of the creative intention of the music and the traditional basis. Drumistic piano performance relies, therefore, on the performer's competence to relate to a drum music, its tradition or ensemble, and the unique performance characteristics of the piano to give a culturally appropriate interpretation of a written drumistic piano work. Now we will consider the next model, which is African vocalism. African vocalism loosely laces together emerging vocal compositional works within and outside Nigeria that seeks to employ idiomatic and inherent features and elements of African indigenous music for an art music composition. The basis of this vocal style is the adaptation of performance techniques from indigenous vocal and instrumental ensembles and the synthesis of the idioms, performance behaviors, and dynamics of such ensembles in the composition of a vocal piece of music. Simulation of Africanism for the voice lays emphasis on the elements of rhythm, percussive sound, dance, fragmented melodic style, cyclic motifs, thematic repetitions, linear textural organization, and tonal organization that characterize most African ensemble music. This manifests in the deployment of tones, melody, rhythm, melorhythm, and harmonic structures. Conscious efforts to transfer the roles of ensemble instruments to the voice in art music form, simulation of drum passages as well as dance and multilinear polyphony, normative in traditional ensemble music. Some of the creative features of the choral style are the dominant use of ostinato variation as a canvas on which music of considerable length is constructed in a variety of moods and textures. The ostinato, which could be in the form of repetition of the main theme, often serves as a unifying force in the composition. Harmonic structures of some of the works do not rely entirely on or vigorously pursue European classical functional harmony. In some instances, communal performance is also evoked to enhance the contrapuntal and polyphonic textures. So these elements give the impression of many layers of sound in operation at a given time. African vocalism seeks to develop a tradition of original art music for the voice that draws from the totality of African traditional music and vocal idioms for its creative expression. These are projected to liberate the creative faculty from the severe limitations of mere folk song arrangements for singers, referred to as African vocalism. For instance, we note that in Igbo harmonic thought, vocal parts constitute the foundation of choral harmonic constituents, which are theoretically rationalized in terms of male and female, that is okay na ne. Now, to bring this section to a conclusion, apart from performance composition, which focuses or explores the African's ability to compose while performing, that is performing through extemporization, we also have the African orchestral model, which is simply an orchestra that combines Western and African traditional instruments. In such an orchestra, African musical instruments are given prominent role. For instance, the ntakrok, which is a woodblock, is allowed to exhibit its dominance in providing the timeline pattern for the music. Alternatively, we could also have an instrument like ikon, that is a xylophone, which is made to lead or control the melodic and rhythmic configuration of the music rather than using instruments like the piano or the organ. And in this case, the piano is not even used at all. So those are some of the African models for the theories that govern or guide African music composition. Thank you. So this aspect of the dialogue centers around the traditional harmonic models in compositional practice in Africa. Western theorists have generated a set of harmonic rules and formats which guides and determines Western harmonies. We've had theorists like Jean-Philippe Rameau, who helped formalize the harmonic treatise of Common Practice period when he put forward the theory that all harmony is based on the root or fundamental note of a chord. Some later theorists came up with the conclusion that the root chord is indeed stronger and firmer than the inversional derivatives because of the presence of the root note as the lowest note compared to the third and the fifth as the lowest notes in the first and second inversions respectively. Now, by the time Richard Wagner came on scene, the sense of tonality and as the unifying musical force had begun to show definite signs of disintegration. Of course, this gave way to Schoenberg's serialism, which came up afterwards. So for Western music, we could see that there had been that process of growth and development well documented. The same process cannot be said to have been documented as it concerns African traditional music. Harmonic patterns and derivations have purely been preserved through the oral culture, where generations grew up to learn from the previous generations orally and orally. It is only in recent years that serious efforts have been made to document what the African knows and practices as harmony. However, some of these documentations have come from Eurocentric points of view by authors who simply conjured up what they believed to be African, but leaving out absolute realities. Now, despite this unfortunate scenario, some African theorists who may have had the opportunity to put forward the realities in the light of African harmonic treatment are themselves already overly influenced or mentally colonized by the Western harmonic tendencies and idiosyncrasies. The result is a harmonic language which is not only syncretic but heavily Western biased, more so considering a bimesical system of which we are said to be practicing. The objective of this section of the discourse is to express adequately what constitutes harmonic content for the African. What are the harmonic models visibly present in African music, and how are these models treated when encountered by Western colonizing hegemony? I will attempt to answer these questions as quickly as possible. African harmony is mostly based on tone systems and multi-part patterns which have a functional interrelationship in African music. It is a two-way dependent phenomenon, in that the kind of tonal system used will depend heavily on the multi-part harmonic patterns used, and also the multi-part harmonic patterns used will depend heavily on the kind of tonal system in place in a particular community. Now, the tonal material used in African musical traditions varies considerably from region to region. Even in Nigeria, which is my own country, which looks very much like a microcosm of the African situation, ethnic heterogeneity means harmonic treatment of music cannot be uniform. Unlike Western harmony, there is no one-size-fits-all arrangement. Tonal organization, tuning procedures, and intervallic structure depend upon a broad range of human community. This being said, there are unifying paradigms which speak to a level of specificity and contribute to unifying the harmonic processes in African music. A very good example is language. Nigeria has more than 500 different languages. Majority of these languages are tonal, especially with regard to the semantic and grammatical importance of speech tone. Words take meanings depending on the tonal inflections inherent in the language. This phonemic phenomenon determines the melodic and harmonic configurations of the people who speak them. I'll make an example with the word Obong, spelled in English O-B-O-N-G, but in Efok, which is my language, is Ob, and that can mean so many things depending on the tonal inflection. For instance, spoken with the two syllables at the same pitch level, Obong, it will mean mosquito. Spoken differently, Obong, that will mean a cane used in flogging. And then the other way, you can say Obong, that means Lord or King. And we have many other derivatives of the same word. Now, we want to take a listen to a dirge from the Ibom ethnic group, which will showcase the way pitch, tonal inflections affects or influences the pitch pattern in terms of harmony. Now, the next idea I would like to discuss is the tone system. In traditional African tonal system, the European diatonic model becomes unemployable, deceptive, and misleading as it is grossly inadequate. This is because the African tone system is determined by the musical-lingual patterns inherent in those traditional systems. Unfortunately, works with this kind of tonal capturing end up being termed by the Western musical powerhouses as substandard, or said not to meet up the appropriate musicking language. It is the opinion of this panel that such curious labeling is tantamount to judging a color through the wrong lenses. It is important to clearly state that while the European diatonic arrangement remains the pillar and source of harmonic creations and derivatives in Western music, traditional African harmonies are based on and derived from the heterogeneous tone systems of various communities. These tone systems produce the harmonic materials employed by Africans in harmonizing. Chief Udoh is a composing performer of Akata music, which is a traditional genre in Ibom of southeastern Nigeria. This excerpt from this song mirrors the Africans' treatment of harmony as derivatives from a tonal system. Let's take a listen.
I don't do that. I don't do that. I don't do that. Bogunya no ba ogudana go be uba okuba uzo. I don't do that. Ya make me ni oni ala mbonga banamze na mukutuzo. I don't do that. Ya make me ni oni ala mbonga banamze na mukutuzo. I don't do that. Ya wonga kama garo wena ro gaga mini nyanyamba. I don't do that.
So, from the excerpt we've just listened to, the melodic and harmonic configurations are based on a pentatonic tone system with the following elements, as we can see on the screen in the slide. Now, melodies and accompanying harmonies are taken from the row above, and then including octaval realizations. This tonal harmony creates a kind of confines or framework within which the African effortlessly explores and exploits his musical milieu. Now, I would also like to note that this harmonic pattern is not learned formally. People don't have to go through trainings to learn how to harmonize in that way, but it comes naturally, generationally transferred through the cultural lines. Next line of thought is on parallelism. Parallelism is a condition where two or more parts move in similar intervallic motion. What is the Western treatment of parallelism in diatonic harmony? Apart from the works of Richard Wagner and his Western mentees, who seemed set on the purpose of dismantling the confines of functional harmony, common music practice does not really smile favorably at parallelism, especially in certain scenarios. Parallel consecutive movements in intervals of seconds, fifths, octaves, and some fourths are discouraged. African harmonies revolve around quite a different system. Therefore, attempting to bring these Eurocentric expectations into traditional African harmony is simply a recipe for harmonic disaster. This is because African monophonic systems are based on octaves, fifths, fourths, and even seconds, all in a perpetual parallel relationship. Voices are not just allowed, but characteristically endorsed to move in these intervals in a parallel relationship. This essentially gives a feeling of the same melodic line being heard in two or more different voices of different degrees at the same time. The idea of this subtle condemnation of this kind of harmonic output from the African standpoint by the powers that be is, to say the least, a musical violence of very high order. A violence whose psychic and psychological impacts remain to be properly explored. I took that from Agawu 2016. So in the example that follows now, the canto is heard being harmonized by a second voice in the lower but parallel registers. The oral intervallic perception of the harmony will show the canto and the subcanto in a parallel relationship. The music is performed by Chief Akpan and his team from Akwa State in the southern parts of Nigeria. Now about part arrangement in African harmony. We know that Western harmony maintains a four-part system which may or may not be increased further depending on the preferred harmonic texture of the composer. Part parts are also structured from the highest sounding parts down to the deepest. Well, this is not the case in African music. All parts assume equal and functional importance. In African music, different pitches are not conceptualized as high or low as they are in the Western system, but as small and big or tiny and fat. Consequently, a slate wooden drum of a large size, which produces low notes, of course, obviously because of the size, is called a ka obodo, which literally interprets to mother slate drum, or you could say the large drum, because the concept of motherhood in Africa speaks to bigness, largeness, and strength. So the ka obodo here is the mother slate drum, while the small-sized horn producing high notes is called a dota, the small horn. Now, these are instruments employed in harmonic ensembles in the Fuki people of southern Nigeria. Now, the concept of motherhood is a different discourse altogether, for which time may not allow right now. But pitches are not termed as high or low, but rather considered in terms of the size, small or big. Now, African music is a three-pronged system. We have the African traditional music, African art music, and then African popular music. So I'm going to African art music right now. And we know that this is a genre that has evolved as a result of historical experience of missionary and colonial intervention. Agago defines this creative art of composition as a transformation of pre-existing material into new, individualized structures. African art music has songs written by Africans but following the Western harmonic system. And in our opinion, in no area of African musical endeavor is Western musical colonialism as pungent as it is in art music. Rules here must be obeyed. So this simplistic obedience, however, robs the African of engaging and maintaining original idioms in their original modes. So the composer is faced with the dilemma of expressing himself with a strange language while trying to capture his own personal intrinsic essences as an African. Composers of art music usually strive to employ and maintain Western harmonic tenets while working with African materials. This results in musical syncretism, which combines the adaptations of Western harmonic system and, like in cases of large works, Western developmental techniques and forms in the one hand, and then the African melodic or rhythmic techniques on the other. As observed by IJ in 2015, the issues involved in the use of syncretic techniques are not only technical, but also cultural, and may involve the composer in issues of levels of consciousness and personal identity. Here are two examples. In the first one, James Varick Ama composes Come Let Us Sing. James Varick Ama is a Ghanaian composer and music director. This work is performed by the Harmonious Choral in Ghana. And then the second example is from the Gospel Isaac's arrangement of a popular hymn tune, Hallelujah, Amen, performed by the Promised Land Choral in Nigeria.
Let us sing unto the Lord. Let's heartily rejoice in the strength of our salvation. Come, let us sing unto
these two good examples of African art music, it will take a deeper analytical listening to differentiate James Ammar's Come Let Us Sing from any of the great Handel's Baroque works. This shows the extent of harmonic and stylistic cloning, which is a central constant in African art music. The last prong right now is the African pop music, which is more or less like African traditional music, as it operates in a wide spectrum. Most recent strands of this mega genre of African music metamorphosed through a crossbreeding with Western popular music. In the first instance, during the slave trade, enslaved Africans were taken to the Americas and Europe with their indigenous music. This gave rise to many genres of Afro-Western popular music like blues, jazz, Afrobeat, salsa, zouk, and rumba. These rhythms and sounds have subsequently been adapted by newer genres like rock and rhythm blues. On the other hand, African popular music has likewise adopted elements, particularly the musical instruments, chord vocabulary, performance and recording studio techniques of Western music. These stylistic syncretism has resulted into quite a number of pop musical styles, including Afrobeats, highlife, African hip-hop, Afro-soul, Azonto, Afro-fuji, and many more. And the harmonic language is mostly that of traditional African nature and those of Western pop music. Parts are mostly triadic and operate in a parallel relationship. Chief Inyang sings the highlife number Ana, and we'll notice the harmonic structure in the horns.
Friday, Kwame Candida, Anadi Concourse, a demi de Merere, a demi de Merero, Moya Tufano Kutumo, Imam Camdo, Limanari, Tapo Yamane, Yamaka Sinse, Ami Momo, Yana Piso Yonde, Yana Piso Yondo, Simi Yansen Piku, Umani Mami Camdo, Limanari, Anna, Edem come on you, Anna, Anna, you come here, you, Anna, Anna, yes, it called on you, Anna,
So, quite noticeable there is the triadic harmony from the horns, mirroring the Afro-American jazz genre, and in parallel movements, which is a deviation from the Western tonal harmony arrangement. I would love to conclude this section by saying that African traditional harmonic treatments are markedly different from those of the West. It is therefore necessary for there to exist a European acceptance and not just a quiet tolerance of what the African understands as harmony without efforts at trying to repair them. Anything short of this will translate to keeping Africans trapped in a prison house of diatonic tonality. Thank you very much for having me.
Hi.
Oral written synergy in African compositions. The imposition of the Western system of notation constitutes another colonizing agency in African music composition. Let me begin with two important observations that Alan Merriam advanced many decades ago as the field of ethnomusicology emerged. First, Merriam noted that the purpose of ethnomusicology is to disabuse ethnocentrics, that the music of other peoples is inferior or unworthy of study and appreciation. One of the ways that the music of other peoples of the world is much abused and maligned by Western music powerhouse has been by its oral traditions. Second, Merriam identified the notion that the music of the folk is fast disappearing and that it must be recorded and studied before it is gone, that it was ethnomusicology's duty to preserve materials, thus in writing about tribal, folk, and oriental music. Interestingly, these two notions have not changed. On the one hand, African music as oral tradition has always been represented comparatively with the written tradition of the West as inferior, and that the only way to upgrade the music of oral tradition is through notation. On the other hand, African music has continued in strength and flourished in urban areas where one would expect the greatest change. In addition, this should be taken within the context that oral music ought to have disappeared by now. But I think the only way oral music can disappear is if we continue to promote systems that can destroy not only the music, but all of us as a people of oral tradition. In the context of Miriam's concerns and the need to pursue conversations in these domains, ICTM dialogue deserves an accolade. In this section, I will focus on oral music as the traditional model for most African-centered compositions, the role of writing in African composition, especially its new model of oral written synergy. Written composition within Africa by African composers is a result of the process of acculturation provoked by colonialism. While written composition has been a driving force for Western art music since the establishment of the staff notation system in 1600, there has been a noticeable move towards the development of written music composition in Africa that was introduced by the Christian missionaries in the form of hymns. Thus, written music became the reference point to proper music learning, which prioritized written music literacy and ignored oral composition's long-standing and valuable tradition. Oral composition is simply composing or music making that takes place among people who have neither an academic background nor a theoretical knowledge in the Western sense of music theory of their culture. We should understand oral composition within the systems of oral tradition. Oral tradition is a body of information that belongs to a particular group of people. Its continuity and existence is by word of mouth that is passed from one generation to another. What is passed and how that is done is decided by what the communal mind deems important to preserve. Orally transmitted knowledge contributes to the development of cognitive hearing, musical memory, and the ability to imitate, on which so much depend in the past, and which may be found valuable as effective tool of learning. In Ibibio culture, for example, orally composed songs are one of the many ways in which traditional groups express themselves. The songs play important roles in their daily lives as vehicles for transmitting indigenous knowledge that comprises musical, societal, and moral values. Thus, the use of language in songs forms part of the process of promoting cultural identity. Songs, for instance, in Ibibio systems, happen in two modes. One is in speech form, we call Ntang, and the other is in song form, which we call Ikwo. Now we'll play two musical examples. One as Ntang, a semi-solo, and then the second, Ntang, as a duet. The concept of Ikwo being song in Ibibio is embedded in Ibibio concept of mbre, musical art interwoven into songs, dance, poetry, drama, etc., and is the product of society. Uta music is an example that we slot in here now. The performance clip just exhibited is a typical Ibibio traditional music, an indigenous African group in vocal and instrumental music composition, utilizing distinct cultural idioms within a multi-rhythmic but interwoven vocal and instrumental ensemble in a given event. The instrumental idioms are didactical to the performance, but symbolic to the society at which or at any given time. Coordinating roles between instruments over voice articulation, regulating of dance patterns in response to the instrumental idioms, embellishing drum patterns in diverse but recurring pulsatic forms are distinct aspects of African indigenous compositions for which their nature does not allow strict written music design. They rather serve as traditional creative designs for identification of cultural models in community life. Such music creation is not influenced by external non-indigenous musical principles and strict written Eurocentric partnering, but are fundamentally African-sensitive, hinging on oral culture and ethno-epistemic model. There are other creative idioms in indigenous music composition that emanate in a combination of oral text and vocables, otherwise called textless words. These are known to be strong and very effective elements of African composition that oftentimes are underutilized by composers in keeping to Western norms, or seen as active performance barriers in a mixed or enculturated situation. Vocables are creative forms in traditional life which either signify satisfaction, appeal, lamentation, relief, boredom, anger, or resistance. In some other ways, they are tools for motivating the people to action or spurring people to action. Practical application of vocables with oral vocal texts in any indigenous music composition or performance are avenues of expressing emotions through musical traditions of African societies. The genre under which such creative element is embedded in this discussion is indigenous African music. Vocables in combination with oral vocal text is a cultural model in traditional composition which truly synergizes African composition. However, in most written forms of traditional composition, vocables exist as mere oral synergies which are intermittently injected as part of extemporized harmony or are utilized as part of a musical phrase, often by cantors. As part of the African composer's bid to create a chart for Africanized oral written compositions, therefore, a combination of these vocables of sorts with musical text can serve as a traditional model or otherwise structured as motifs for growing or developing African music against colonized art forms of Africa. The musical insert herein clearly demonstrates how vocables are utilized as part of our oral culture in many cultural enclaves in Ibibio communities in Nigeria.
Yo, yo.
Composition in the Ibibio system is developed by individuals or group of individuals in a community who initiate the nucleus of an idea, which may consist of the basic lyrics and tune. This idea may be developed in collaboration with a master musician if the initiator is not the same person as the master musician. Once developed, the composition may be taught to the community's local groups or rehearsals. The composition is translated into performance at certain context-driven events or context-driven events and festivals, at which time the community is given opportunity to participate in the performance. Furthermore, the performance process is dynamic, creating room for personal expressions that conform to the confines of established norms. At this point, the society, therefore, holds the right to approve or disapprove of a particular composition, performance, or performer according to established cultural ethos. Ibibio composition may be text-driven as in songs, or structure-driven as in some instrumental music. In both processes, language nuances are manipulated to provide the main compositional ingredients. This is unlike structural manipulation in Western art music. A very common feature of musical composition is the call and response form, presenting two complementary forces, the cantor, leader, and the group community. Text-driven composition. Songs of all types derive their impetus from the song text as it generates melodic interest, as well as aesthetic qualities of a song. Songs may function in a dance context, or they may lack dance qualities. Dance-oriented songs are accompanied by instruments such as xylophones, drums, wood or metal instruments, horns or guards, or hand clapping, or any combination of these. Songs involving multiple participants are invariably structured in call and response form. The ability to extemporize enables fresh textual elements to be interjected or the initial tune embellished. The response section is often simple enough to invoke community participation. This section is often sung in different voice parts, which can be polyphonic. Clearly established procedures for multi-part singing are specific to each tradition and operate in definite tonal modes or scale. The Ibibio use different modes and scales such as ditonic, tritonic, teratonic, pentatonic, hexatonic, or even heptatonic. These scales are derived from songs, as songs also form scales. Here we exhibit a musical example in tritonic scale. The song is captioned Nkebere Edward Kuten. Nkebere Edward Kuten anke Edward abere anke Ebara doke anke abere doke anke. That's the beauty of the thing in just 3 tones. The problem with the Western notation. Unfortunately, the notation systems, staff and tonic sulfur notation, have not been able to represent the compositions of indigenous composers accurately. For instance, it is very possible to rehearse written music within the sonic spectrum represented in the score. Example, Mozart's sonatas can be performed according to interpretations provided in the score. But most African written compositions have a synergy of both the written and oral dimensions of music. This means that there are many aspects of oral composition that cannot be represented effectively using the conventional notations. This has nothing to do with standardization of traditional African musical instruments, because Meke Nzewi has invented a notation system that takes into consideration the many unpitched aspects of African music. However, the problem simply is the traditional African music as oral music cannot be completely notated. The way forward, the oral-written synergy. Notation in African sensed methods happens mostly at the end of the performance, especially in oral traditions. But with the emergence of the colonizing influence of notation, African composers are forced to write their composition before performance. Although these new methods have their own advantages and shortcomings, African composers have continued to explore notation to their benefits. For example, the model of lead sheet for jazz music is synchronic of African ways and interpretations. The notation prevalent with popular music presents another model for modern traditional composition. The important fact here to note is that oral composition is now matched with written composition, and both dimensions as a cultural tradition should be explored in tandem. The last example in this presentation demonstrates the oral-written synergy. It is composed by Christian Onyeji, captioned Amuwuranyi Otunwa, meaning For Us a Child is Born, published by Oxford University Press. On the screen, however, the score is clearly written, showing only the voice parts. But afterwards, the actual performance of the same song in its visual state shall roll for your consumption. The performance features a drum intro, while the piece is accompanied by the drum. This means the performance adds other features including dance and clap that are indigenous models and are juxtaposed with a written representation. This is one way to decolonize African compositions using traditional models. Thank you.
Thank you, the presenters. I think your position is quite clear on decolonizing composition in Africa, and probably also in institutions where these compositions are generally coming from. You know, many of our Nigerian composers and African composers work as professors in different institutions where they teach and practice composition. So we have listened to the panel, and we've heard their argument, we've followed their thought. It is time, based on the number of minutes we still have for this session, to engage them in discussions, questions, comments, and other contributions that will aid in the objective of decolonizing African art music. The floor is open for those who have questions. Carlos, you guide us in terms of how many the duration of time we still have. Thank you. Anybody with questions can raise hand electronically so we can recognize that person.
Yeah, I will just say that Sui Beng is in charge of handling time.
Oh, okay.
So
Sui, sorry. Sui, you will be able to guide us in terms of how many minutes we still have left. We have Maria Agatha Ozar, who has raised her hand. Please ask your question so we can respond. And the presenters, please be ready to respond appropriately. Maria Ozar, you have the floor. Please unmute yourself and talk to us. Agatha.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can see you also.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Yes, I was asked to really come in here and act at the discussion, so not really to present a paper. And I want to really thank the scholars who just presented from about composition and African music, Nigerian music, and so on. The area is an area that I've lived in, so I'm familiar also with the music. And it really intrigues me to see how these scholars have been able to try to go into the theories, try to go into histories, and trying to find ways in which traditional music can be decolonized. However, there are other things, as they were speaking, a lot of things were just like coming into my head. And some of the things I was asking myself is how much how much of our cultural tones are still able to retain or are still able to be retained when our traditional instruments are being reconstructed and forced to the Western skills. Because when you force, yeah, exactly. So when you force the instruments of a traditional people to begin to follow just one specific scale, you are gradually changing the whole music of that culture. And all my people that I've just presented are from a culture where the xylophone is very, very important. And they can bear me witness that most of our xylophones from this area have all been like retuned to sound diatonic. So
yeah, thank you. We get your point.
I have another one too, sorry.
Okay.
Then parallels, please, the parallels. Again, the question is, at what point did we Africans begin to abhor parallelism in music composition? Because it was invoked in the medieval period. It changed. So is it possible that we could come back to it and hold it back again? Can there really be a way of notating oral music? With all the... Thank you.
Thank you. We've got your point there. So any of the panelists move to respond? Akpakpan, Charles, Ukeme. There are two questions here. One, on tuning our instruments in modern times to the diatonic system, particularly of the heptatonic scale, how that is taking us away from our cultural practices. And secondly, on the whole idea of parallelism, which is condemned in Western arts music, particularly in four-part harmony. And its roots in African indigenous music, where it was the mainstay of our choral music. You had people singing parallel thirds, fifths, and so on. But today it seems to be a crime. So anybody who can respond to that?
Yes. Let me look at the issue of the xylophones, where as part of the process to decolonize, we are beginning to ask traditional persons who construct these instruments to return back to the pentatonic system, because that seems to be the original system of the indigenous culture as we know from what we have seen in the songs and many other aspects of this tradition. So the new system that they have brought forth, that is the diatonic system now, is completely Western. So the process is for us to advise those that construct the instrument to be sure that they return back to the pentatonic scale system. Thank you.
All right.
For the next question, Charles will take that, sir.
Let me quickly respond to your submission. When you say we advise, is it still possible in the light of the fact that most of these people have embraced Christianity? They go to church, they listen to hymns, they are tuned, adjusted to, heptatonic singing from popular music, from Christian music, from every sound around them. It's all about do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do in some ways. How do we engage in that enterprise of bringing them back? Of course, it's not only pentatonic. We had dyads, tetratonic, pentatonic, hexatonic, and so on. So how do you suggest that this happens? Are we going to mount megaphones around the villages and then go back to what they are no longer, used to? Some of them don't even know it because younger generation have taken over the construction of these instruments and they're operating from what they are used to now, which is heptatonic scale, church scales, music, hymns. They go to church every time, they listen to popular music, and what they hear informs what they put together in their instruments. How do we achieve this?
You know that most of our songs, the traditional songs, do not change their scale system. Now, like the Council for Arts and Culture, I saw that they have
different sets of xylophones. And so one is pentatonic, the other one is heptatonic, the other one is hexatonic. And my question with them was, why do you have all this? He said that what they do is, depending on the kind of music they want to present, they use the scale system that suits that. And so that means that there are some of these persons who construct traditional instruments that are still familiar or that are still exploring these scales systems in their construction.
Okay, we take that. The next question was on parallelism. Who is handling it?
Yes,
Charles.
Good morning. Yes, parallelism. In terms of, I think the major area we have parallelism. If you go into the local performances, we have they use traditional music. They still use parallelism well, and without having to learn, like I said when I was presenting, these people just learn it, just comes like that, transfer to oral culture, and they do it in such a way that even we.
You're muted, Charles. Can you unmute yourself?
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
So we even find it because they do it naturally. So they make use of the. Am I on, please?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Yes, so the parallelism is still very much in use. It's actually natural. That's why I said it is not something that we try to encourage. It is actually part and parcel. It is when we come to art music, because these art music composers try to write in the system, using the system of Western music, which abhors to some level parallelism. And that is where the issue comes in. That is why we're trying to advocate that the inclusion or the stranglehold of Western harmonic system, we should find a way of relaxing it and allowing systems that are embedded in the African culture to come up and take place, and to balance up the equation. Let it not just be Western music. Let's have a balanced system, as we try to say we are having a bi-musical system. It should be a balance of both Western and then the African music when it comes to African art music.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Any other person? You can raise your hand electronically, will be recognized. Any person? Otherwise, I will ask my questions. Not originally on this panel, I was drafted to, moderate, which is good for me because my name has been mentioned several times so that I can be on the platform to ask questions, as an independent person. Thank you. Let me ask, there are issues, somebody raised the issue of notation, of using Western notation to represent indigenous or African art music compositions in terms of elements that are drawn from within. And he argued that it's not good enough for the representation of elements from African music. My question is, do we actually see notation as an end or a means? Because even in Western music, notation has never been an end. It's only a means to what is to be presented in terms of performance and interpretation. Because in contemporary music or more postmodern music, you find all sorts of graphic notations and presentations which require some time of reading, interpretation, and absorption for the performance to be held. Why do we argue differently in African art, in African music, particularly African art music, when over the years there are representations? Sometimes you have plus or minus on the notes. Sometimes you have indefinite, sound representation. There are so many things that characterize African art music that are captured in some ways in written art music. Why do we argue on this, that we can represent African art music, when globally too, notation is just not an end on its own, it's a means? That's one. I don't know anybody that will take that. Secondly, I want to ask, when we talk about Africanization, indigenization, decolonization, I've argued somewhere, and I want you to, respond to it, that Africanization or decolonization actually started from the point of contact of Africans with Western art music. I say this in the sense that the moment hymns were introduced to Africans, they started singing them in the African way. They started approaching their compositions in their own way. They started performing this music in their own voice culture and emotional input. So can't we stand on that fact that Africanization started at that point, that all we are talking about now is refinement of that process? Somebody can respond to this. This is a position, but you can argue for or against it. So two issues, one notation, one Africanization.
Let me take the issue of notation. What we are looking at here is not art music per se. We are not concerned much about that, because art music itself came with the written tradition of the West. Our concern is unwritten compositions. That is, there are many songs. For instance, in the last presentation, there are many kinds of effect that you have in African songs that you cannot be able to notate them. And so we are saying that, yes, we agree that the system that we have for notation serves, but it serves more maybe when you're writing songs. But there are other things that are embedded in the songs that we cannot completely write them out. So we are saying that African composers should understand this, and so they should not over-labor themselves, trying to see how they can, invent a system that may not be able to really write or to notate oral songs.
Okay. That's okay from your own perspective, because even in terms of notating or transcribing indigenous songs, even Meki and a couple of us have argued that there's nothing peculiar about our own music. In fact, if we say that we are going back to the origin of the idea of ethnomusicology, when it was termed as, when it originally started as that comparative musicology or something, where it was argued that anything outside Western art music was strange. And so applied the different techniques and so on. But today, we are arguing that it is still the same music. And of course, a lot of Europeans have accepted that it's music on its own and bears all the elements of music. And so it should be, processed through musicological, discourses and analysis. And when we begin to argue that our own music requires some strange means, it means that all the traditional music of the world are different from ours, which is not. If you recall, when we were in Thailand, I had to flare up when African music group was said to be African music's group. And I questioned that, and then I'm still on it, but that's a different issue now. So, but the point is that we're operating from the same cultural platform of, indigenous music of different, parts of the world. Attempts have been made to notate indigenous music, and we believe that the specifics can be represented in different ways, and that is being done. So Africa, takes its lead from there. Let's hear Ozar, who is also raising hand on this matter.
Before that, there are questions on the chat. There are questions on the chat, please.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, that's what I wanted to let you know, that there are a lot of questions on the chat.
I thought they were great.
No, okay. And then just to add to my what I was trying to deliberate on initially, Prof, I don't think that Africans trying to find a way to notate their music or to do something extra about their music is trying to take us out of the culture of the world. No, because if we look at Indonesia, for example, Indonesia still have their pelog and their slendro scales, which they use in composing, okay? And those scales, even though they have 5-tone pentatonic and heptatonic, but their equidistances are totally different from the Western world. And this is the point, this is where I'm coming from. Have we been able to arrive at that point where we say, yes, and I'm taking up Dr. Ukeme on this too, where we're able to say pentatonic, but what are the equidistances that distinguishes a pentatonic scale of the Ibibio or Efik people from that of the Yoruba or the Igbo people? So this is where my own argument is.
I would suggest that let's take the questions of the audience first, because we are the internal people. Karen Bindu sent a question, says, the music education. The second question is, if you have access to recordings by Miriam and others, let us take, there are two questions. How could the interest into oral music be implicated in the music education at schools? And whether you have access to recordings of Miriam and others.
Let me take the second question. We don't have access to those recordings that you're talking about. I think Akpakpan will talk about the first aspect. That is oral music education in school.
Definitely, it all depends on the level of education. I'm taking the question on oral music in school.
I'm not.
Bill, we're hearing you. Yeah.
All right. It all depends on the level of education. In the primary schools, secondary schools, we don't have nice oral music education. But at the university level, that's the tertiary institution level, we try as much as possible to cop in some elements of oral music into our performance, compositional and other musical pedagogical principles here.
Okay, let me also add that even at that primary level, they depend more on oral music presentations because they don't use notations. Or that's in kind of supporting what he said. It depends on who is teaching and where it's being taught. Let's take the next question, which is from Najwa Adra. It says, to what extent does borrowing go the other way? For example, did Western rap borrow from African spoken song like the Ntan we heard? I think you can make an answer that.
We cannot simply say that Western rap, that is African American music, is different from what is happening here. For example, the Ntang that has been mentioned, because from the history of Afro-American music, we have seen that most of what has happened in that system is the product of the African traditions. So I think we cannot simply say that is not true, except that we should also dig into some historical factors and other things to be really certain of some of these questions that we have raised here.
Yeah, let me also add, so sorry to add that, yes, the West borrowed a lot from Africa in their rap music. Yeah. Particularly, let us even start from jazz. Jazz developed from African, music, and it became global through the, slave songs and all that. And today we know that rap, started from those, what we talk about, the ghettos in the US and so on. But we know that there are, borrowings from Africa and going the other way, the same way we are taking from West. So it's fairly balanced in some ways, but we're talking about the force these things bring to the culture of the various continents. The next question is from Sui Beng Tang. She says, isn't it, the term African art music, isn't it colonial to use this term? Does it represent your intention to decolonize? Africa is a big continent with many nations and peoples. I don't know who will take that quickly. We don't have much time.
Well, the concept of art music here, we have said that it is Nigeria is a microcosm of Africa. That means we can also say Nigerian art music, but our main focus here is art music. That is music that borrows its own tradition from the West, and where African elements are embedded in them. So we can, mostly we call it African art music, but we have the Nigerian version of it, we have the Ghanaian version of it, and we have this spread all over the sub-Saharan Africa.
Oh yeah, Sui, let me also come in there. You see, it's a difficult bone to chew, when you're handed a tradition, particularly, let's just say you just go to a doctor and the doctor prescribes. You have no choice. You just go and take what is given to you. Over the years, it's been the tradition to call it art music or written music or literary music. So because that tradition has been sustained and embedded in whatever we do, it is natural that Africans take that word. And of course, it's colonial in the sense that its origin and roots is not from Africa. It's not indigenous to us. It is borrowed. It's alien to us, but we're trying to indigenize it. Probably with time, we'll come up with a proper term that will describe what we're doing, because we've been struggling with this whole idea of making the music our own and from our own, So, but it's been a bit difficult because we are using the harmony, we're using the instruments, we're using the orchestration, we're using the theory, we're so many things that are foreign to us. But we are in the process, and we hope that if not in this generation, probably the next generation, as we hand over to them, will find appropriate terminology or name for what we're doing. But right now, we're still depending on that whole concept of art music, which to us is written music. And once it is written, it has its limitations. Like they try to argue, it has its own scope, different from what we do in Africa as indigenous music, where there's liberty for so many things and pursues a different direction entirely. Here it's a different thing with minimal or reduced or fairly selective audience. But we're working on it, and we believe someday something new will happen. Yes, we still have some minutes. I don't know anybody with any question or suggestion. Otherwise, we'll call on Agatha Ozar to continue with what she wanted to say initially. You're free, sister, to continue. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Again, talking about African art music, you know, what comes to mind again is making Nzewi's theories and discussions on rather using musical arts, which really like embodies everything that is done in African music in terms of music, dance, theater, and so on. You know, and then also, if you also begin to look at the ways we deal with our music, whether in writing or composition, if we also begin to look at it from that humanistic part, which a humanistic point of view, which in fact is very much embedded in our traditional music, I think will also go a long way. Another question I had was for Boniface, you know, the whole idea of oral tradition. We talked about making Nzewi coming up with some form of notational system in order to notate our music. But I was thrilled by the example that I saw. I don't know who really showed it, of a traditional Nigerian music being performed in a Western, I don't know if it is a church. And but for me, I closed my eyes so I don't see the people, but I could also feel all their emotions, you know, in it, which in fact is part of this humanistic aspect that is so embedded in African music. But my question for Boniface is, can we really notate oral tradition? And if we are able to do that, is it possible to do it and then to put some kind of ad-lib thing, because it has to be humanistic, it has to be natural, it has to come from not just the emotions, but also it has to come from that inner thing, which I'm still struggling to find words, that is so predominant in African music performances. Is it going to be possible to, you know, give some instructions on that, meaning that that notation will really not be as strict as the Western notation? Is there a possibility?
Hello?
Yes.
I don't know whether... Okay. Yes, as we have said earlier, African music can be notated in any form. But the fact is that when it comes to those oral idioms and all those ones, we can only bring them in as motifs, dropping them ad libitum, you know, to exhibit those effects that we want to create and whatever role we want them to, how we want them to impact on a performance. It is very possible. And it is also part of our creative endowment individually to exactly think of how to impact those and effect those in a performance, such that we give freedom to anybody who would want to replicate the performance, such that the person will exhibit it on his own way, freely. That's the way I could come in. I don't know whether I've answered the question.
Yeah, let me also come in again with the whole concept of notation of African music and of African art music. These are two different traditions. And when you move into one tradition, you abide by its tenets and use the tools, you know, acceptable within that tradition. Once you enter Western art music, if you some definition I gave somewhere, you use the tools of Western art music. That is where ab initio you begin to think of tonality in terms of key, time signature, and in fact, in all the indices that must be there. You operate at that level. In the African sense, you are dealing with oral tradition in which people are free to express themselves. And of course, you can capture what they have done. And like I said, notation is not an end. You provide guide. Most of the time, we see that notation is a guide for performance. And you can leave room for people to even express themselves. Like my Christmas carol that was performed outside Nigeria in other places, they introduced other instruments to express themselves. It is allowed, it is acceptable. It is not in the strict sense of Western sonata, for instance, for piano. You can't bring another instrument to join because the work is strictly written for that instrument. Not that we cannot say in the strict sense that what we have written should be performed as written. But we find that, let us say in an African traditional presentation, the music performed today takes a different form when it's performed tomorrow, because there's always an open-ended structure or form for it. It's not a fixed form like Mickey has argued somewhere. It's not a form fixed. It's open. And that is why its cadence is different. I've argued is an aggregate of sound features that will give a sense of finality at any given point in time. It is not in terms of chords that are progressed in a way that once it stops, it is stopped. Here we have opportunity to recreate the music every time. It's a transformation process each time we present the music. So the issue of notation must be understood as, is even handled in contemporary times. It's not something that is, the laws of, is not cast in stone, so to say. It's something that opens up opportunity for the performer to interpret and to extend. That's the issue of performance. Performance is not like a repetition. You interpret. There's no performance of a group you listen to today that will be the same tomorrow on the strictest sense of the word. It's always a refinement or a representation. So that's just the point. And finally, I don't know whether we still have up to 5 minutes. There was somebody that presented, I think it was the second or so, the third presentation that says the bibliomusical examples. He played elements. He played an example of a biblio presentation, choral presentation, which he argued was an example of how elements of the biblio music should be captured in the choral music. And I felt I disagree in some ways in terms of the idiom of the composition, because when I listened to that, it still represented itself in the Western idiom. I mean, it's like what I have written on native air. The difference between native air and Western anthems at the time native air came as an alternative was to bring home the textual and some elements of our indigenous music. But the whole structure, the whole nature has still been Western in terms of harmonic, melodic, and structural idioms and form. But yes, it tries to pursue inclusion of certain elements of our indigenous music, but that was not totally achieved. So, of course, it became very popular because it was an immediate alternative to the Western, forms, which, choral forms, which were entirely, most of the time, in English or German or that. But because this brought home our music in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of stories, in terms of biblical interpretations in our native languages, it was quickly accepted as the alternative to, Western anthems. And many composers have gained prominence, like Sam Ojukwu, amongst the Igbo people, Sam Ojukwu, Dan Ago, and quite a number of them who, took up that tradition and made it so popular in different contexts, particularly in the church. And today we don't have much of, secular music happening outside the church, but that is what has been. Today we are struggling. That's how I came up with African vocalism, to bring it more closer to our indigenous practices, what we do. And so when people listen to what is contained in my concept of African vocalism, particularly what we developed at Nsukka, which we call Nsukka Choral School. You'll find that it shifted a great deal from the native air practice. It's quite different because we are deliberate in terms of pursuing that which is original to us. I also have a question here, or some, James Amaebe wants to contribute. He says, I'm not able to contribute because I'm in a very noisy environment for a funeral service. Please bear with me. Okay. He's excusing himself. We don't know. He's obliged. It's part of our culture. You can't stay away from funeral that concerns you. It's part of where indigenous music also happens. We accept and bear with him. He would have loved to contribute, but he's involved in a funeral arrangement or a proceedings for somebody. Any final thoughts or questions or suggestions? So otherwise we can end the session. It's been great. We've had a wonderful time with the people on composition, and they have given us a lot of documents on particularly theoretical positions on composing art music in Africa. Sister.
Yes. Let me also join Professor Onyeji and the whole ITCM team, Suibeng, Carlos. Let me join these people in thanking all of us for joining in this conversation. I am very, very sure that this is not going to be the end of this conversation. This is just the start of this conversation. And we invite all our friends who have taken part in this discussion to please share your ideas. I mean, if we interact within, in between cultures, within cultures, we would be able to come out with stronger points and ways to deal with decolonization, which is a process that is really in all cultures at the moment. So I want to thank you very sincerely from Nigeria, and thank you, Onyeji, for
moderating. Yeah. Let me also finally conclude on this, and particularly to Carlos, who had to deal with inconsistencies of internet and submission issues, and has been patient with us from here, and to Sui, who is in charge. It's been wonderful. She's a very calm person. In fact, when I look at her, I get my energy back in terms of what we are going through here. And to the panel, it's been wonderful. A lot has been going on in Africa in terms of compositions and art music. In fact, we just formed an international forum for art music that Bodeo Mojola is handling. We had a very session that was coordinated by Harvard University. And we had a 3-day seminar on art music composition in Africa. So you will be ready when these things materialize fully. You'll be integrated. Let me say that it's been wonderful, and I thank everyone who found time to participate, particularly those who listened carefully to and asked questions that enable us to interact and dialogue more. I thank you so much, and hope that...
Thank you before you last words.
Say?
I said, let me thank you for what you say your final words. I want to thank everybody, especially our Prof.
Onyeji, who has been very helpful, especially much of what we are saying. We are very young scholars, as you can see. Most of what we are saying, we have been able to extract some of their works there, especially domestic piano, African vocalism, and many of these works. We have not written much in this area, but he has written a whole lot. He has even made a composition in Ibom or so that demonstrates some of this work. So that's where we are drawing most of our ideas from. So we thank you, Prof, very, very much. And to Suibeng, thank you. The software you sent to me has been very useful. Thank you very much. The link has been very useful. To Carlos, thank you. Thank you for being patient with us. Thank you. We are very grateful.
I think, Sui, you can end the session if you have some comment to make. It's already 2 hours. Sui, are you with us?
No, I don't have anything to say. It's been a wonderful session.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Just thank everybody for their participation, and you know, I learned a lot from all of you. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So bye-bye, everybody. We'll see you again at the next session. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.